one. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another exciting film journey here on Inside Movies Galore. I am one of your hosts, but tonight we are continuing our Going to War theme as I believe it was Jacob's turn to subject us to a film, so why don't you tell us? And be a dear.
And for once, your description may well be accurate. So, we are tackling one of the better known and in many corners better regarded and in many other corners more contentious of the films ever to win Best Picture at the Oscars, Michael Cimino's 1978 epic film, The Deer Hunter. IMDb describes it as an in-depth examination of the ways in which the Vietnam War impacts and disrupts the lives of several friends in a small steel mill town in Pennsylvania. Film, of course, features Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken in an Oscar-winning role, John Cazale in his final role, John Savage, Meryl Streep, and a number of other folks. Just over 3 hours, so we have 2 3-hour movies in a row. Apologies about that. I didn't realize that I was setting us up for that. So we'll start going around the room here. And I'll just start on my left here. Tammy, is this your first time seeing The Deer Hunter? And what was your initial reaction?
Yeah, it was my first time. I guess in a way I like this one better than the one last week because it wasn't it wasn't fighting, it wasn't the fighting part for the most part of the movie, I mean, I like that there was more of a storyline behind it and everything, I felt it was sad in lots of ways, and but then again, war is not a happy thing for anybody. So, I don't know a lot about war movies and all that stuff. So, from what I gathered from it, it was probably pretty true to the events that were going on and everything and things that happened. So, yeah, it was interesting enough too that I did actually pay attention to it and everything. Yeah, I mean, for a war movie, yeah, I found it to be okay because, like I said, I'm not a war movie person. So,
all right. So a war movie for people that don't watch war movies, huh?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. Is that your
yeah, because I don't really want to say too much until like we're getting into it and talking about the different characters and stuff. So
right. Good idea. All righty. Dave, is this your first time seeing The Deer Hunter? And what was your first reaction to it?
I believe I've actually seen this movie in bits and pieces, so I guess I would have to say yes, this is my first time watching it in its entirety. And it does have some sad moments. It has some people in here you don't even fucking recognize, and some who you'd swear they were Babyface Nelson at one point in time, young Christopher Walken. So that being said, I thought it was trying to be as entertaining as it could be, at least leading up to a time of war, and the aftermath is just as brutal, you know. So I feel like if you've ever seen Apocalypse Now, this is like the tamer version. If you get my drift. So, I did enjoy watching the film. Finally, it was interesting to see a cast of characters that were part of The Godfather, and whatnot. So, yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say for right now.
Am I next?
Did you hear me? Yeah, I figure as much.
Well, I'm on mute. I don't know whether. Did you have to go out, Jacob?
Did I have my mic on? How long have I been muted?
Well, at least since Dave finished his first impressions.
Okay, shoot. So I was going on and no one heard me. Oh, whatever. But yeah, so Brandon, is this your first time with the Deer Hunter, and what was your impression?
No, this is not my first time. Though I think I slept through the first time, but I did see it once. To me, there's 4 kinds of war movies. You've got your epic heroics, which, you know, sort of like the one we watched last week, is kind of the whole epic heroism and sacrifice, and not quite glorifying war, but coming close. You've got your propaganda pieces, which are outright glorifying war.
Unless they're propaganda against.
Or unless they're propaganda against. You've got your Cold War films, which are something completely different. But we'll be hitting that next week. And then we got the final one, which is pretty much this and most Vietnam War, because I don't know of many that are like, yes, war is glorious for Vietnam. But the horrors of war, similar to what we were watching at the beginning of the month.
Right.
And this one definitely falls into that category. Not super horrors of war, but as enough. And I did like that. I didn't pick up on the whole structure until the end, until like this time watching it, because the first time watching it, I was more, it was 3 hours.
Yeah.
Even this time, it was a struggle. I watched it over a period of 3 days. That's the reason why I was like, I better get started on this Tuesday. And I finished by Thursday, so I did get it finished. Which is all fair, because I watched it basically equivalent to 3 parts.
Mm-hmm.
Because you got the going to war, you've got the at war,
you got the pre-war, really, yeah.
After war.
Yeah. So,
you know, it kind of fit out. And I got more out of it this time than just the Russian roulette. It's been parodied so many times in pop culture that it was hard to remember what the original was. So it was kind of good that I got to remind myself. It's been so long. So good film, hard film to watch. Not one that I would watch often. Not necessarily because it's a hard film to watch, but more because it's a long film to watch. So with that being said, it wasn't too bad.
All right. So, for me personally, this is not the first time I've seen it. I'm pretty sure it's the second time. And I remember the first time I saw it, I was very impressed. But I also was like, I'm not really in a hurry to see that again. And so it took me a long time to add it to the collection. And then it was sitting on the shelf for the longest time. And to be honest, one of the big reasons I picked it was so I would finally have an excuse to watch it and take care of my copy. But also, I felt for a while this is one that would be worth bringing to the group. I thought it for a while it would be one that could bring a good discussion. And so when Dave suggested war movies, for those two reasons, it immediately jumped to mind. But there was also kind of an odd reason, too. There is a book that came out, I think, near the start of the year. It's a book by Kristen Hanna called The Women. And if anyone's familiar at all with Kristen Hanna, she does write some romances, but she also writes period pieces that are heavily researched and tend to be pretty damn good. And I've read a couple of them. The Nightingale takes place in World War II. The Four Winds takes place during the Depression in the Dust Bowl region. The Women follows a woman who is a nurse in Vietnam. And the whole point of it is essentially it delves deep into not only the effect the war had on people generally, the reception that people had after the war. And part of that reception was the fact that most people don't even realize women served on the battlefront. They were nurses, but they were still seeing combat. So that's still fresh in my mind. That book had a major impression to me. And so I was like, you know what? This would be a good opportunity to tackle a Vietnam movie that is about the same basic idea of the effect war has on people. I had totally forgotten how small a role the war actually plays in this movie. It's more about the people than it is about the war. I had kind of the whole in-country battle war part, probably less than an hour long. Brandon said you could split it into 3. I think the going to war section was much longer than the war part was. And frankly, it's kind of abrupt and choppy once you get to the war, although one could argue that's appropriate, because war is not smooth and tidy. And
war never changes.
But at any rate, the movie has been percolating in my brain for a long time, and I finally was like, it's time to see it again. I'm curious to see it in light of this other film. Other book, and an idea occurred to me just a couple of days before watching it, really, that in some ways the deer hunter is part of the problem that was being addressed in that book, because this was the first major Hollywood production about Vietnam. It did predate Apocalypse Now by about a year. It was the first. Vietnam was still basically taboo in Hollywood when this went into production. So it kind of set the template for a lot of what was to follow. Supposedly, this movie helped inspire the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And so there are a lot of things that this movie kind of set the tone after that initial anti-war sentiment of the early 70s. So I thought in the context of that book, this is even more interesting to watch this movie now. So for me, going into it this time around, I had a lot going into it, but I also was a little bit disappointed. I'm like, I remember this being better than it is. And part of it is the extraordinarily choppy editing at the start of the war sequences, the extreme length of the wedding sequence, just the overall length of the film is quite a bit. But there's some interesting things about it. And then, of course, doing my research afterwards, I find out that this film, another thing that kind of rose some red flags for me as I watched the film this time, I come to find out raised red flags for a lot of people at the time. And that is the film is borderline racist in its depiction of the Vietnamese people. Absolutely racist in the way it depicts the North Vietnamese. And it does not give much context to make the South Vietnamese seem better. Also, the reports of Russian roulette are presented in the film as if it was a major component of the war. And it does make a great allegory for what these people are going through. It's a brilliant allegory for what these people are going through, but it's presented as a factual thing when in reality it apparently was based on a smattering of reports. So the film was arguably very misrepresenting of the actual history. And there's been a lot of controversy about the screenplay, and the original screenwriter has straight up said most of his information was the news. He didn't have time to do real research. And Michael Cimino himself drew the screenplay from the screenwriter and basically tried to commandeer it as his own. And there was a lot of controversy over who actually wrote the final movie. But at any rate, in fact, two of the people who got credit for writing the screenplay were not at all involved. They just had a script of their own about people playing Russian roulette in Vegas that got incorporated into the film. And hey, Dustin. Well, bye, Dustin. I guess there you go. Dustin is just in time because I'm pretty much wrapping up my final thoughts. Dustin, is this your first time seeing Deer Hunter, and what were your impressions?
Well, I've heard about it a lot from other media, and so I didn't know what it was about. I remembered. I'm trying to make this not sound kind of stupid, but well, it is a silly story, so here goes. So I really like Turok, like the old like games and comics and stuff. And there was a Turok movie in 2008, like an animated one to help promote the Xbox game. And on the commentary track for that, like there's a scene where like Turok like takes down a pterodactyl, and when it's on the ground, he like snaps its neck. And in the commentary, they made a big deal about it. It's like, yeah, we got that from the Deer Hunter. So I always thought that that was a thing in the Deer Hunter. And to my surprise, I mean, maybe like I got a phone call or something during that moment, but that was not in here that I could find. So I had no idea it involved Vietnam, or that it was 3 hours long, or it was a war movie, or that, you know, there are rats in here that came from this, or the Russian roulette thing. I'd always wondered in movies, what the hell are they talking about? Where is this from? Why are there so many parodies of this? And it's like, oh, it's the Deer Hunter. So a lot of questions were answered today, but I am still unsatisfied because I did not get my neck break.
Yeah, no pterodactyls either, no. But
well, no, I was more reasonable on that. I thought I didn't accept that.
Right. Oh man. But yeah, actually you bring up a good point. Supposedly a lot of people feel that this movie popularized the concept of Russian roulette in pop culture. And a lot of people hold it against the film. but I could see how it would have helped make it a thing. So at any rate, was that it for you, Dustin, for the beginning, for the startup?
I mean, I thought it was fine. I didn't really have a lot of expectations going in,
Okay.
just because I didn't know anything about it. So.
All right. Well, glad to have you join us, though. This is a movie that I think will have some potential for discussion. So I guess to start it off, Brandon already mentioned this, and it's a good place as any. The film kind of is split into three parts. Basically before, during, and after, as far as the war goes. The before, we're introduced to these people. There's a group of basically 6 friends, if my math is correct, who work in a steel mill in small town Pennsylvania. You got Mike, who's played by Robert De Niro, Nick, who's played by Christopher Walken, Stanley is played by John Cazale, or Cazale. I never did know exactly how to say his name. I feel bad about that. But anyway, John Savage plays Stephen. John is played by George Zunza. Don't know if that's the right way to say it. And Axel is played by Chuck Aspegren, who apparently was not a professional actor. He actually did work as a foreman in one of these mills. And apparently they liked him so much they gave him a role in the movie.
He just looked like Will Menaker from Chapo Trap. Huh?
Pretty much. And then, of course, notably, this is Cazale's last performance. He died of cancer right after the film was completed.
Yep. Lung cancer, because he was a chain smoker.
Yeah. And Cazale pulled off one of the greatest hat tricks in cinema history. He had one television role, and he was in one short film. And then he was in 5 feature films over 7 years. He was in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather Part 2, Sidney Lumet's Dog Day Afternoon, and Michael Cimino's Deer Hunter. Every film he was in was nominated for Best Picture. And I think 3 of them won. I think this one won. I want to say The Godfather Part 2. They may have been the winners.
Next year when we do that franchise thing, one of us is going to pick The Godfather.
We have to do The Godfather one of these days. Of course, his role of Fredo Corleone was his first ever film role. And, of course, he was central to one of the most famous scenes in any movie ever. One of the biggest betrayals in any movie ever, you might say. Which, in real life, John Cazale and Al Pacino were apparently good buds. And another weird kind of ironic thing about this film, another central member of the cast, Linda, is played by Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep was dating John Cazale at the time and actually got him a role in the film. And when the producers found out he was sick with cancer, they wanted to fire him. And she said, if he goes, I go. And Cimino actually backed them up, apparently. It's one of the few things he did, apparently, that was decent. Because apparently he was a bit of a prick. But in the film, she plays a character who's torn between Mike, Robert De Niro's character, and Nick, Christopher Walken's character. Stan doesn't even enter into it. So it's kind of funny that she was actually dating him. But that's your main cast, is those 7 characters, particularly Mike and Nick, and arguably Stan and Linda. And Steven. And Mike and Nick and Steven are the ones who go to Vietnam. They're the ones who volunteer and go off to war. the first 2 years of this film, I think it was 67 and 68. And then I think the remainder of the film takes place in 75, I think. So it's like early going, when going to Vietnam was still something that people wanted to do for family and for country. And it hadn't yet, the public opinion had not yet turned.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the film takes place kind of in the after, where, where it wasn't really that bad in this movie, which I think may have actually been one of the less accurate parts of the film. But we'll get to that when we get to it. But what do y'all think of our core cast, like those main characters? Are there any like real standout ones for y'all, or?
Well,
Yeah.
The wedding kind of gave me a basic idea of what was going on, about knowing, okay, well, this guy's marrying the girl, and the other guy with the beard really wanted the girl for himself, but was kind of beaten to the punch. But really and truly, it wasn't until they went to deer hunting themselves, which I guess the title card, that I really got to know them, because I really felt like the wedding kind of just went on and on and on. I felt like there was more wedding and less exposition, and really that first scene is put there to show the characters, the relationships between the characters, the potential conflict between the characters, and then after establishing it, move on. It didn't want to move on quickly enough, in my opinion.
No, but I do like the fact that there was a Green Beret that showed up during the wedding. And this was the first, I would have to say, their first encounter with what was to come with the Vietnam War,
Oh no, that's not one of the things I'd say would be cut. If I was cutting, it would be more of like the extended dance scenes and stuff like that. No, the Green Beret thing was good. It was a foreshadowing moment that needed to happen. And for those of us who know history well enough, know that the Vietnam War was not a nice time.
Right. Well, it was.
I just wanted to add, I think I'm going to kind of defend how long that first act was, like before they're in Vietnam, because it's the three parts are kind of before, during, and after.
Mm-hmm.
And those are acts. But I think spending so much time with them before like they get destroyed really kind of sells the rest of the film, because it's like you believe these people all have real lives. Like you spend quite a lot of time with them, and I think that is probably a big reason for the success of this, like why it had so much impact on people. Because a lot of these events, like if you just saw them in like a typical like action movie or whatever, it would just feel kind of like more of the same,
Well, Stephen King once said in an interview,
there weren't that many of things like this, but
I mean, Stephen King once said in an interview when he was talking about his style of writing, is that one of the reasons why people find his books as scary as they are is because he spends so much time defining the characters at the beginning, so that by the time you get to the scary stuff, you actually have investment in the characters that are going to die.
Oh, absolutely. I fully agree. I do think one of the things I was reading about this one is that Cimino apparently straight up lied to his producers in terms of how long the wedding scene was going to be. I think he promised them 20 minutes and delivered something closer to 45. And he just straight up, people have claimed that he told them, don't you dare cut a minute of that wedding scene. It apparently was something that really, 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 for whatever reason, he wanted it in its entirety. I personally, I don't think he needed that much of the wedding, but I do think that a few tucks here, a few nips there to maybe make it 10 minutes shorter, 5 minutes could have gone. I think 5 minutes could have gone and we wouldn't have missed much at all in terms of the characterization. But it's not just the wedding and those early scenes. We do have a scene at the steel mill. We do have a scene of Steven's mother complaining bitterly about the whole thing, which that may or may not have been necessary. But it's worth noting Steven is the one getting married, and he's marrying Angela, who they don't come right out and say that she's knocked up, but
she's knocked up with another man's child.
It's pretty much, they don't really come out and say it, but the mother straight up says she's not light, if you know what I mean, or something along those lines. And it is hinted. And apparently Cimino eventually confirmed this in an interview. It's heavily hinted that Steven's not the father. And apparently Cimino eventually said it was Nick. So, which makes sense because it seems like Nick is a player in this movie. He ostensibly is with Linda, but she also has eyes for Mike, and it's kind of, it's a little awkward all around. But and then at the wedding, you see this woman who's trying to make eyes at Mike, and he only has eyes for Linda. And then later, you see her dancing with Nick, and it's like, yeah, this guy gets around a bit. But and then we do have the post-wedding hunting trip where obviously Steven is not with them. He's on his, honeymoon. But the others go, and on the trip, you get the bonding time that someone already mentioned. You get a lot more bonding time with them, and you learn a little more of some of their quirks that you hadn't already picked up on. But one thing that you learn really early, I think you kind of picked up on it already, but on the trip, Mike straight up tells Nick, I come out hunting when you can come. If I can't bring you along, I go alone. I don't need these other jokers. So it's obvious that their bond is much closer in a sense than.
There's also something that De Niro says to Nick before they end up at the wedding party per se, that he says something about it only takes one shot, because that's all. Because when it comes down to the exact shot you need, it only takes one. And then I think he also says something about how he likes the trees and the nature of it all.
That was kind of Nick's response. They were talking about what the value of the hunting, and I think that may have actually been when Mike said he just needs Nick to go with him. I think that was actually when he said that. But you're right, that was earlier.
I was gonna say something about the wedding. You guys,
okay.
I thought it was possibly a little long, but maybe in a way it was a good thing, because you did get them somewhat start to know him, and maybe for other people like me that aren't really into war movies, this might have made them continue watching it and made them kind of get into it more, because you did get to know the people. Between, and everything. Or if it would have gone like right into war or whatever, you might have lost some of the audience.
And that is absolutely a valid point. I think because The Godfather also starts with a wedding. The Godfather, I think they did a better job of incorporating story into the wedding scenes. Personally, I think that. I think you're absolutely right that spending all this time with the characters before they go to war was a brilliant move. But I feel like a lot of the screen time, what I was saying could be cut, was more like all the time that was spent on dancing and music and all that stuff, that there wasn't really a great deal, to my mind, of characterization going on in those scenes. I don't know if y'all would agree with me on that.
There was some.
Yeah, there was some.
Yeah, it didn't have to have all of the dancing. I do agree with that. But
I think it was
Yeah.
more about
like
like
the
putting you
wedding,
there, like kind of in the
it
party.
just made them seem
Right.
more real.
Right. Which actually,
No.
Cimino did a lot of things to increase the realism, quote unquote. And apparently, I think it's kind of a funny story. Apparently, he asked a lot of the extras in that scene, when you come to work tomorrow, would you please bring packages that we can use as props? And he intended them to bring empty boxes wrapped up to look like presents. But apparently, most of them actually brought presents. So apparently, they got to keep a whole bunch of extra swag. So that was kind of funny. But he wanted them to get into the spirit. So even the extras, he wanted them to get into the spirit and treat it like it was an actual wedding. So yeah, a lot of that may have been him trying to get the audience to feel the same way. So
I know Tammy turned to me and said, "Look at all those wedding presents."
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's a good budget way to improve your props department. Have the extras do it for you. But apparently some of the other stuff he did for realism was a little bit less fun. When Steve is in the cage later on and he's dealing with the rats, those were real rats, and that was supposedly his real reaction. Like, can you do something about these rats? You know, it's like, yeah, that was not in character. That was, he didn't like being surrounded by rats. But anywho, so anything, well, it's okay. So we do have the hunting trip. We do have the killing of a deer, which apparently they tranquilized the deer, so that's good. Part of me was concerned that their drive for realism had gone a little further than it needed to. But I think Dave, I think you mentioned, and then I think I might have got us sidetracked, so sorry about that. But the whole how he was talking about it just takes one shot. I think Nick was making some sort of a offhand comment about where he would be aiming or something to that effect, and basically Mike's like, no, you don't need to do all that, you just take your shot where you're supposed to, and you're good. But that was a really good. How do I want to say that? That got turned around rather beautifully later in the film. Let's put it that way. Not in a pleasant way, but in a very intriguing way. It gets turned around later on. So, any further thoughts on? I didn't really get it. We all launched right into the talking about the wedding scene. I didn't really get a response to the initial question of what y'all thought of our main cast. Were there any characters that y'all wanted to comment on or make some note on?
Well, I am kind of glad that Meryl Streep's character was able to go to those guys and ask if she could like use their place while they were like going airborne into the
Yeah.
war, because of the abusive father.
Yeah.
Those were definitely a little bit of bruising
Yeah.
that she ended up having.
She got smacked around pretty hard by her drunk, abusive father right before the wedding. And she showed up heavily made up to try to hide the bruise. And I don't know who commented on it, but someone did
And
comment.
at the tail end of the party, we saw Robert De Niro running butt ass naked down the street. So
Yeah. That's, you know, as you do. But
Yeah, that part kind of surprised me. I wasn't expecting that.
Well, if we're getting back to the question about like other impressions of the characters, so my dad used to work at a tool factory, and our characters, when we meet them in that first half, they feel like the guys my dad would like hang out with.
okay.
Like just that kind of like, oh yeah, we work in the foundry, we work in the shop, just that kind of like factory like floor like bonding kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of hard to put to words, but I think you get what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Like it made them feel like really real to me, because I did meet people who were kind of like that. I mean, we were in a different setting in a different city, but still the same kind of camaraderie. I mean, they did have a lot of sports leagues, and they would go out and do stuff like these guys did.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was the coach for a lot of the Elko sports leagues. So.
Okay. Good deal. Yeah, we do at one point see that apparently most, if not all of them, are on a bowling league. And so we do spend some time later on in a bowling alley. It's kind of fun. It's fun to go out and bowl with a group. It is. I like it a lot. But anyway,
and bowling was one of the big ones that he was in charge of.
A lot of bowling back in those days.
Yeah, oh yeah. So, I'll do a quick little, I guess, a quick little rundown then. Like I said, our main guy is Mike. Mike is sort of, well, he is the title character. He is the deer hunter. He is the one who, that's his sort of zen
nickname.
Happy place. What's up?
Nickname almost?
Well, yeah, almost. I don't know that. Did they call him that? They may have called him that. But like I said, that's kind of his way to unwind, to let loose. He'll go with the guys to drink or whatnot. But like for him, the hunting is really, that's his thing. And again, he has sort of a unrequited love for Linda, although it does seem to be partially requited. She seems to genuinely like both of them and be a little bit indecisive. But when we're first introduced to her, he straight up blows her off. It's like she comes in one side of the trailer, greets Nick, and then they come in, and Mike's in the trailer getting ready. And as they come in the front, he goes out the back, and it's almost like he waited to do it, like pointedly almost. But he pretty much blows her off. But it might have also partly be because he overheard her asking Nick for a place to stay, and he agrees wholeheartedly without even conferring with his roommate. So that I could understand fully how that could be awkward. But and then we have Nick, who, like I said before, he seems to be a little bit of a player. I think Dave was the one that commented on how he was talking about the trees were his zen thing. That he says that he loves the countryside of where they live and he can't imagine living somewhere else. He really doesn't, which is kind of ironic given what happens with him later. But that's, Nick. Stan is sort of a very unhappy guy. He carries a gun and everyone mocks him for it. It's just a little pistol. It almost looks like a starter pistol more than anything. And one of the interesting weird ironies is that at one point, they are like, who do you think you are, John Wayne? And apparently, John Wayne died barely a year after Cazale did, also of cancer. So there's that. But also, John Wayne was the one who presented the Best Picture award to this movie, and apparently he hated the movie. So that was probably an awkward moment.
Well, John Wayne was known to be pretty dumb. Let's be real.
Yeah, we know, but I just find that kind of an interesting little bit of an irony that they made that John Wayne reference with some of those later things. And then you got the other guys. Let's see here. I think Axel, like I said, the guy that actually was played by a legitimate steel worker, is, I think, he's the guy I think that just likes to curse a lot, if I'm remembering. And then John actually runs the bar that is their local watering hole. And it must be great to have a bartender who's one of your buds, a bar owner who's one of your buds, if you drink as much as these people do. But it was kind of interesting.
That's what you did in the 70s.
Well, yeah. I mean, especially if you work in an industrial town, I guess hunting and drinking are your main options, and bowling are probably your main options for entertainment. Probably even today. So
there were getting back to kind of those experiences with like people who worked in places like this.
Right.
There was like I don't know if it was necessarily official, but my dad's two hangouts would be like after work, Polish Falcons Club and White Eagle Club. And the White Eagle Club had its own bowling alley in the building. So a lot of his work friends would just meet him there after work. They would pretty much just go straight to the bar from work a lot of times.
Wow.
It's a culture that is really kind of lost, thanks to I would like to say thanks to the reformation of things in the 80s, but definitely a culture that is hard for anybody to identify with these days.
It was still kind of kicking in the 90s, but by 2000, like that was it.
I mean, again, certain elements of it certainly have hung on. I mean, I lived and worked long enough in the mountains to know that the whole idea of you have a bar you go to after work is definitely still alive and well.
Oh, well, Emporia, that was the same thing.
Yeah.
Since I didn't really drink much at the time, I went straight home and watched movies every day. So,
yeah.
And the same thing. And then, of course, during the weekends, I went to Richmond to game.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was get drunk, do drugs, or stay home. So,
more or less, yeah.
I mean, you can do those at home.
Yeah, and a lot of people do. Just because they do it at the bar does not mean they stop when they get home. That's unfortunately in many cases.
My dad did kind of mostly do it just at the bar.
Okay. Well, like I said, in many cases, but like I definitely knew some people in Salem who were raging alcoholics, and it's still a thing. But anyway, enough. We've got a pretty good intro to these people, and I think it's the first hour and a quarter really that these opening sequences take place in. And then it is pretty freaking abrupt from there. We cut to a sequence in Vietnam where Michael, who's a Green Beret himself, is laying beaten and wounded and looking like he could be close to death, surrounded by people who are clearly dead. And he is, you see people going around, you see this one guy going around just making sure, kind of picking people off. He lifts up what we find out is a entrance to a hidey hole and tosses a grenade in. And then you see this woman run out, clutching her child with burns on both their bodies, and he just annihilates her. And right before De Niro gets up with a flamethrower, Mike gets up with a flamethrower and just toasts the guy. And then we get helicopters come out of nowhere, and it just happens that Nick and Steven are on this particular crew. And then we kind of cut to them all suddenly are now in captivity. And I don't know how much of this was actually filmed. Apparently, the original cut of the film was much, much, much longer.
I find it weird that this would be the parts that they would cut and not the wedding scene.
Yeah.
At least get to where you know why they were, like how they were captured.
Yeah.
But I guess they looked at it as this part really doesn't matter as much as the other parts.
Right.
I mean, now there was, I'll admit, when I see the Green Beret scene in the first part of the film, I keep coming back to the Rambo Part 1, with the guy going, "Him Green Berets are real badasses." I don't know why, but it always comes back to me when I see that, with them looking back to the deputy like,
I
"You're an
suppose
idiot."
it isn't that far of a stretch to count missing it in action as that cut footage.
What's that?
Missing in action.
It wouldn't be that far of a stretch if you wanted to count missing in action. Chuck Norris's
Well,
to be
if
that
you really
missing.
want to look at it, if you really want to look at it, First Blood Part 1 is a Vietnam War film.
Right.
It's just a Vietnam War film taking place shortly after the war. It's at Part 3 all over again.
Yeah.
Well, the other quote unquote Vietnam movie I saw this year was Southern Comfort, so pretty different, but that's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, and this one is quite different as Vietnam movies go, because again, the focus is not on the war so much as its effect. And while they apparently played fast and loose with facts, they did try to get into sort of a nitty-gritty personal approach, which actually this film has a lot in common with Barefoot Gen in the way that it takes a much more personal approach versus The Longest Day, which you had a huge ton of characters, but you don't really get to know most, it's definitely a different approach taken with that. But yeah, we do have once they're in captivity, the sudden cuts are gone for a while because they spend a lot of time on that, and they spend a lot of time on this whole idea that these captors are very sadistic and brutal and pretty much get off on using Russian roulette on the captives. They use it as a way of gambling to pass the time, pretty much. And the guy who is I guess you could call him the referee, is a particularly nasty character. He really is a piece of work.
Is this the only Vietnam film that uses the Russian roulette thing? Because I don't think I ever see it anywhere else.
I could not.
I would assume so, because when I was trying to see if I could find like that neck snap scene that I thought I missed, one of the more common results was, anachronistic Russian roulette scenes in The Deer Hunter. And it's like, oh, okay. So, and then there were a lot of articles about how that wasn't accurate.
Right. And apparently it really pissed off the Russians too. I can't remember which festival. I think it might have been Cannes, but there was a film festival where the entire Soviet delegation walked out. They were pissed.
I don't think any Americans had any worries about making the Russians mad at that point. Not that point in time.
Well, Cannes is supposed to be a place where all the countries come together. That's like their whole thing. And so you got to admit, play like Cannes or the Olympics or something like that that's supposed to be about international cooperation and unity, you don't really want walkouts, But I'm sure a lot of the people at home didn't really care, But you do have, you've got this depiction of like these people they're in these bamboo cages with wire, like barbed wire. They're half submerged in the water. There's this thing they call the pit where you're almost entirely submerged in the river and you basically get just enough room to breathe. You got to deal with rats. You got to deal with the blood dripping down from the people that get shot. It's such nasty, filthy conditions. And again, I'm sure a lot of this was exaggerated. I have heard really horrible things about what the POWs had to deal with. But what I've heard, I feel like even here, it's exaggerated for dramatic effect. And it is effective. It is dramatically effective, or I would say so at least. But this scene pretty much breaks Steven. It pretty much breaks him. He becomes a quivering mess, and they end up throwing him in the pit because he refuses to shoot anyone. Himself. You know what I mean. He refuses to fire the gun. Let's put it that way. And you end up eventually, Mike and Nick hatch a plot that's insane, but it ends up working, where they ask their captors to put more bullets in the gun, knowing that will then give. Mike knows what's up. Nick kind of has bits of it. He kind of has an idea.
Mike is more the mastermind behind that plan.
Yes. And that's one thing that we learn early on, is that Mike is generally the leader of the group. He is the go-to guy for stuff, you might say.
If not for Mike, Steven wouldn't have been able to get through his ordeal of the initial Russian roulette.
For a second there, I thought you were backtracking and saying his ordeal of getting married. But and he does have to be propped up. If I remember correctly, he almost tries to duck the wedding. Stephen is not a very strong character generally in this film. Oh, I can't believe we almost forgot apparently this was one of the most important scenes in the film. Apparently Cimino, according to reports on set, was obsessed with getting this one specific shot, and it wasn't working. And supposedly he himself finally went up and made it happen in the wedding scene. it's worth noting that it's a Russian Orthodox wedding. And I'm not entirely sure about. No, that wouldn't work. If it did, that opens up a whole other can of worms. So I'm not even going to say that. But it appears that either Stephen or Angela or both are Russian Orthodox. Nick is also Russian Orthodox. It's less clear who the others are, what the others are.
According to IMDb, it says they are Slavic American.
Yes. Russian, Slavic. Yeah.
Honestly,
But they're specifically, that is what the church is. It's a Russian Orthodox church. And apparently they have a tradition, which I thought was kind of cool. I've actually never seen this before. But they had this tradition of the couple doing a toast from a split chalice, where they each had like a little mini chalice that came together to one base. And I'm like, that's actually kind of a cool tradition. I don't think I'd ever heard of that before. But apparently the tradition that goes along with it, and they say it in the film, don't drop any of the wine or it will be a bad omen. And it shows them drinking, and then we get an ultra close-up of Angela's wedding dress, and we see like 2 or 3 drops fall on her dress. And it is an awesome omen. I will give Cimino this, that his obsession with getting that shot, I think, was a great payoff in the end, because it definitely, as soon as that happened, you knew Steven's screwed. But
up to that point, you really didn't have a whole lot of like ominous or like concerning stuff. Like you kind of forget this is supposed to be a war movie.
Yeah.
And up to that point, like, isn't there like even a music cue, like dun dun dun, like dun or something, like just a subtle one, to where it's like it feels like something bad is going to happen.
Yeah. But
So,
apparently Cimino, it wasn't working. Like they kept trying and trying and trying, and the drops weren't falling right, or the camera didn't get it. And so according to IMDb's stuff, apparently he set up a ladder just outside of the shot. They did an ultra close-up, and he personally dropped the wine on her dress to make sure it would work. I'm like, okay, well, you do what you got to do, right?
I mean, big eyedropper, it'd probably be fine.
Could be, yeah. But or turkey based, or I don't know, whatever you wanted to use.
It'd probably have to be an eyedropper, because you would get like a big squirt of stuff with a turkey.
That's true. That's true. So anyway, back to his terrible fate. Like I said, he basically snaps and he gets thrown in the pit, and that's where we have the whole the rats sort of sequence that happens, which apparently Cimino, actually there were rats. That wasn't scripted. Savage's action was real, and apparently the director's like, oh, I'm keeping this shot. So but in the end, Mike gives this idea of the captors putting more bullets in the gun, and he survives the shot. And then, knowing that the chamber has moved, he then points the gun at his captors and starts firing. And he manages to take 3 of them out, because they gave him a loaded gun with 3 bullets. So they managed to effect their escape. And they go and rescue Stephen as well. And they more or less get away, but then during the helicopter rescue, they happen to see some American soldiers in helicopters, and Nick gets pulled up fine, but Stephen and Mike have a harder time and they end up falling back into the river and getting drifted downstream, and they get picked up later. And by this point, Steven has had some very serious injuries. It looks like he broke his legs in the fall.
Yes.
So he is barely hanging on. And we don't find out until much later what his ultimate fate was. And when we do, it turns out that he lost both legs and an arm. So he's basically hopping around in a wheelchair with just one arm, and obviously pretty severe depression, among other things.
Well, Nick isn't far from that depression stage. I guess he contracted some PTSD from.
Yes. And this is one of the things where, accuracy or not, the whole Russian roulette thing was a really great allegory for the cruelty and randomness of war. And I think that's what that's what Cimino was going for. I think he was like, I don't give a damn if this actually happened. It's what I'm trying to present in the film. And it is. It's like, you don't know which chamber the bullet's in. You don't know which moment will be your last. You got to watch other people die in front of you. There are so many things that happened in those scenes that kind of encapsulate the things that these people had to deal with. So dramatically, I can see that it was a valid and useful technique. It just may not have been all that accurate. But you're right. Nick, after this, he's pretty shell-shocked too. And when we see him, we actually follow him for a good chunk of the film. It kind of switches over to him for a minute. And he's pretty freaking shell-shocked for a while. And then he ends up stumbling on underground Russian roulette taking place within the military, within the American military area. The South Vietnamese apparently do the same thing. And I think this was one of the areas where the movie got the most criticism, was the implication that the South Vietnamese could be just as cruel and bloodthirsty as the North Vietnamese. I think that probably pissed off a lot of people. But the idea that it's an underground thing that's not supposed to be spoken of at least mitigates that a little bit. It's not out in the open. But Nick happens to stumble across this. For whatever reason, Mike is already there watching the same thing. And Nick disappears. And that pretty much ends the war sequence, because then we go to Mike's return home. But before we do that, did anyone have anything else they want to talk about for this segment of the film? Like anything that we skipped or that needs further?
I had to watch this. Oddly enough, I had to watch it multiple times. The part at the end, because I kept falling asleep, which was kind of sad. But I kept feeling like I missed something. So I wanted to watch it to make sure I got the whole scene in.
Mm-hmm.
And I really did like the whole idea of, him getting multiple bullets for the gun. Mm-hmm. And it is kind of sad when you get to that part when they finally get to the main city, and then the one guy basically gets trapped there in this kind of, hey, you can make a lot of money by doing this stuff. Mm-hmm. To me, I don't really think it's a demonization one way or the other. I mean, people have morbid senses of this, and no matter what, I would actually consider the South Vietnamese to be more likely to have engaged in this, because they're more, they would be more free, I guess, to do these things than the North Vietnamese would have. Of course, then again, not that, I mean, I've heard some pretty wild things from those times in those areas. So it would not surprise me to see it there.
Right. Well, like I said, I'm not so saying one way or the other. It's just I do know that there was a lot of controversy about that depiction, like for better or worse. You know,
Well, yeah, I mean, you're not going to want to say, well, the free-loving people are acting the same as the communists.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, never mind that in some corners of America, people probably wish they could do that, you know? And again, this was that whole Russian roulette idea apparently was lifted from a script that was supposed to take place in Vegas. So
also wouldn't surprise me.
yeah. So kind of interesting to think of that. But so basically, and then we get to the part that was like what I guess could be argued was meant to be sort of the meat of the film, sort of what was meant to be the where they were really going with all this, which is where they go where Mike comes home to what is supposed to be a hero's welcome. Like everyone's all together, they're all ready to welcome him home. Like, yay, here comes the war hero and all that kind of stuff. And he doesn't want to deal with it. He kind of slinks back. He waits until they're all gone and then drops in and says hi to Linda, gets his stuff, and she convinces him to let her come along he wants to go stay in a hotel. He doesn't want to stay in the house. And he makes the rounds the next day and tells everyone, hey, how's it going? I'm back. And some of them do, like, hey, man, we were all ready for you. Where were you? You know? And this, once he reconnects with the other guys, with Axel and Stan and John, he then asks, so how is Angela? And then they all freeze up and they're all like, well, after she talked to Steven, and he's like, what, Steven's back? And they're like, yeah. You know, they don't know what to say at this point. And that's where, you know, we kind of realize that, oh, things didn't go well for him after all, did they? So he goes over and basically she is practically catatonic. She is shell-shocked from everything. It looks like her mother apparently is taking care of the child, more or less. And he pretty much forces her to, where is he? You know, he pretty much forces her. She finally breaks down and writes it down. She can't even bring herself to say what's going on. And he kind of gets it and kind of puts it aside. I'm trying to remember what triggered him actually going and looking Steven up after a while, but he doesn't do it right away. But other than that, we've got, I'm actually drawing a blank here. I believe is this where he goes on
he goes on another hunting trip, I think, before he goes to try and talk to Stevie.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, the hunting trip is definitely interesting because of what he does
the hunting
with
trip.
the guy's pistol.
Yeah. So yeah, he goes on another hunting trip with the three guys, and he finds that he's right. Without Nick there, it doesn't feel right. And I couldn't quite tell if it was just because Nick not being there messed it up for him, or if he just doesn't have the stomach for killing anymore. It might be both. But he doesn't kill the deer. He actually misses the shot, which is very weird for him. And he ends up going back. If I remember correctly, I think they comment on that. If I'm remembering correctly, I think he says that I missed, and they said, that's kind of odd. But Stan has been brandishing his little pistol again. And this is where Mike kind of snaps, and he grabs the gun, drops all but one of the bullets, and spins the chamber, and basically does Russian roulette on his friend. And of course, he doesn't end up shooting him, but it scares the shit out of Stan. And I think he throws the gun away. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, he does.
Yeah,
I took that as on the one hand, it was kind of like a triggering moment for him, seeing just somebody so casually play with the gun like that. Yeah. And also, I mean, this guy has been clearly screwing around like this forever, and I could tell that from the dialogue. It's like, all right, big shot, here you go, just show it, and just showing him kind of like what he went through.
Yeah.
And it really put that guy in his place. And I think that was something that it needed to be done for a long time, judging from the way everybody reacts and the things De Niro says in that scene.
Yeah.
So I thought that was great. Although it definitely would have been very, very scary. I mean, he was pointing the gun at another one of their friends, and he was like, "Yeah, it's not loaded." And Mike's just like, "Not loaded," and he just shoots it into the ceiling, and there is a bullet.
But that's after he takes the gun to his. That's right after he takes the gun to his head and pulls the trigger once, and then aims up into the air, which is almost psychotic. But that's again, I think that the portrayal that the actor does from coming back from the war is very well done. You can tell a huge difference by how he plays the part in the first section of it versus here. He's much more distant. He's more quiet. You can tell that there's a piece of him that really was left behind,
right,
in the war, and that is really well done.
Right, and again, you see that in all three of the main characters. I mean, like I said, John Savage, Stephen, he is straight up broken. He is completely broken by the whole thing, literally and figuratively. Nick loses something too. He just completely loses. Honestly, and I always thought of him as, and maybe it was a mischaracterization the first time I saw the movie, but because this time around I feel like there was a little more nuance than what people would usually think of. If you say, "Oh, he is suicidal, he no longer wants to live," but in a sense, that's exactly what it is. You would not spend several years playing Russian roulette if you really want to live a long life.
Well, and he find out that he was actually sending money to the friend who lost his legs.
Yeah, he was sending Steven a ton of money. That's actually where Mike found out that Nick A is still alive, and B, he thinks he knows exactly where he got the money, because he did see him leave with the Frenchman the first time. The guy that basically, the guy who tried to recruit him when they first met, tried to get him to be like, "Why don't you do this? You make so much money," and all, I don't think for a second Nick even gave a damn about the money, even if he wasn't sending it home. I don't think he would have been doing it for the money. And it wasn't for the thrill either. It was something to do, I guess you could say.
Well, it's you get an impulse, you get a drive for self-destruction.
Yeah.
And it's like you're not, how do I put this? It's like you're not seeking it out, like you're not making it happen yourself, but you're putting yourself in situations where it can happen because you just don't care anymore.
Right. Exactly. It was, I guess you could say it would be a good example of someone who has, a death wish, as they say, but not really wanting or perhaps able to bring it about themselves. And I guess he saw it as an opportunity to help out a friend one last time or something. But yeah, so we have all those sequences. And I will say this is one thing that the film got absolutely right. And I really, really like the way that they did this was the way that the people they didn't just change, they came back to friends and family who thought they would be the same. You know what I mean? Like they didn't these other people had not only did they have no idea what these people had been through, they had no idea that this is not the same Mike at all. And they were really slow on the uptake. So I think that was also one of the reasons he snapped. Because, and then also with Steven, they knew that he lost limbs and they understood that, but they had no concept of what he had been through and how to reach him now, I guess is the best way to put it. So like I said, I personally think the movie got that right, which is good.
Yeah, this is still pretty close to the generation where you didn't really talk about your feelings or like work through your problems. It was just kind of a, deal with it, get over it, why are you asking for help kind of thing. So, I mean, like, I think that was more of like a World War II attitude. And I think things are starting to change probably around this time. Yeah, and I would bet Vietnam is the reason a lot of that stuff started to change.
Well, yeah. In the mental health field, PTSD was, it was talked about even back then, shell shock. George Carlin bit that he used to put in is like, sounds like the shells themselves. But PTSD, the first time you really and truly hear about it in the mental health field, like spoken of seriously, is this film. Because you see stuff, like World War II, there have been like accounts of General Patton basically yelling at people with obvious PTSD to get right back there in the battlefield and stop being pansies and stuff like that. And of course, most people back in that time would say, yeah, that's right, go back in, you pansy. But here's where people actually were starting to really acknowledge it was a thing, because these people weren't just doing that, but they were going off and going crazy. I've seen, that's how something would happen. I remember my one of my cousins, I can't remember what he would do is whenever if he would get drunk, he would actually get into a flashback, and if he had a gun, he would shoot at you. Because he was still seeing, he was flashing back to those times.
Yeah. So,
that's the first time. Then of course, as the like 80s and 90s, you start realizing, oh yeah, many women have PTSD from, attacks that men did on them.
Right.
And so on. It's and it became more widespread, more accepted to be treated, probably around the 90s.
Well, and also on that note,
shell shock is a World War I term.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and also on that note that Brandon was just referring to, again, one of the inspirations I had for deciding to watch this movie now was, again, the Book for Women. And in that one, they talk at much length about the PTSD, but they also talk at much length about the idea, yes, in that book, her father was of that older generation where you were just supposed to suck it up. You were not supposed to talk about it. So a lot of people were dealing with pushback from their own families who not only couldn't understand them, but did not want them to talk about it because that's not what you do. And what it was made even worse, and this was a point that was made, of course, the book also adds the wrinkle of the main character being a woman. That doesn't apply here. But the other thing is that by the middle-ish of the Vietnam of America's of involvement, American sentiment toward the war turned hard. And a lot of people were just plain disgusted by the war. There were a lot of news reports that really painted American soldiers in a very bad light. There were a lot of people who, again, people didn't understand these things that these people were experiencing. So a lot of people were being treated as burnouts and dangerous, and people, not everyone was Travis Bickle, but a lot of people were acting like they were. You know what I mean? Like, there was a lot of not just anti-Vietnam, but anti-war, anti-soldier sentiment. So a lot of people had to keep quiet in order to just get by without being treated like shit by everybody.
Well, that's one thing I think they did poorly in this film is,
yeah.
I mean, the guy was going around in his uniform all the time.
Yeah.
And I was expecting it. It's like, yeah, not a single negative thing towards him. I mean, my stepfather-in-law, I remember him getting back. He wears his Vietnam cap all the time now.
Mm-hmm.
And he was drafted. He couldn't really afford to run.
Mm-hmm.
And when he got back, of course, he still can't go up in an aircraft without worries because he was a helicopter pilot.
Yeah.
So, but when he came back, everybody was hating on the people who served, whether they served voluntarily or not.
Mm-hmm.
And he was afraid to wear the hat or identify as a Vietnam vet. It wasn't until the late 90s when suddenly attitudes kind of shifted and people were more like, thank you for your service and so on, that he finally started doing that. And that's
it's unfortunate. The Vietnam vets did not get the respect that they technically deserved for even going over there.
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand where the sentiment was coming from because it was one of the first wars. I think it was one of the things I remember from Across the Universe was like, this is the first war that we can see broadcast to our living rooms.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yes, because everybody got to see what was going on and hear it.
Yeah.
Like no other war. The problem is a lot of people didn't understand. It didn't seem to differentiate that some people didn't have a choice. And it's like, well, you should have died then, stuff like that. It's like, well, easy for you to say. Because you don't have to face that choice. So I do feel like that was kind of wrong how people treated Vietnam vets at the time.
One thing that is
historically, I think that's probably one of our least justifiable wars, if not our most unjustifiable war. So I think we were pretty clearly the bad guys in that conflict. If you look at it, I mean, did we necessarily need to step in? Like, what would have happened if we had just not gone?
We would have had better relations with Vietnam at the time. There's actually been reports that have come out nowadays that shows that the people in North Vietnam were trying to reach out to the United States to be on friendly terms once that takeover took place. But oh well, we got there eventually, I guess.
One thing I do want to say on Brandon, your point on the changing attitudes, there was a subtle shift. Some of the films like this one and Apocalypse Now kind of helped dig the hole deeper, I guess you could say, but they also started the process of Hollywood examining the war in a way that hadn't been done yet. So that kind of opened a little bit of a subtle change. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was a subtle change back toward actually respecting the people. That apparently went up in 82. They put up the Three Soldiers statue in 84, and the Women's Memorial was added in 93. So those three events helped shift views a little bit back to a more moderate viewpoint. But yeah, I think you're all right that like real change took a while. and like I said, one of the reasons why that book that I keep talking about was even written was that even today, most people still kind of assume that it was, quote, a man's war. You know what I mean?
No, women have been on the front line of things since World War One. You know?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's the thing. That's the point.
Just
people think nurses have it easy.
Side men, it's not.
It's like I've said for a long time that I could never be in the medical. I've said for a long time I could never be in. What's that?
Nothing.
No, sorry. I was going to say I've said for a long time I could never be in the medical profession because I don't have the stomach for it. And it's like I don't know how people can look at that and then look at people who are in the nurses and doctors in wartime and say just because you're not on the front lines, you're not seeing war. I'm like, the bullshit.
Yeah, I know.
Well,
I know
mean,
very well.
if you want to be like really hardcore about it, I think if anybody was following the news in the fall and even up till now, I mean, you'll see doctors in the Gaza war zone talking about the things they've seen.
Yeah.
And because it's people that I'm getting in trouble. Because it's people that the American public doesn't necessarily like identify with or really care about all that much. You kind of see how little that actually matters in practice. Because I mean, even I've just seen. I mean, you can just post pictures of what's happening like live, like on Twitter now, and I have seen some pretty mangled bodies, like real bodies. And after a point, it's just like, well, what can we do? So, and this sort of ties into a criticism of another movie, Alex Garland's Civil War, which is more about, oh, look how important it is to be journalists during wartime and document everything. It's like, well, what are you documenting everything for? What is the purpose of this? It's like, it'll help stop wars by changing minds. And as we again saw like last fall, I mean, all of this coverage and all of this reporting meant literally nothing to the great majority of people, because it was just like, oh, well, we don't really care about this group of people being slaughtered, so it doesn't matter. So I think that's an important thing to mention when we're talking about war movies and some of the impact they have, where it's not always going to be the same. I mean, like, did this move the needle, I bet, on the conversations about Vietnam and like PTSD and stuff? It sounds like it absolutely did. But, the idea that a movie is always going to have that impact, I don't know,
It certainly should have more. Sometimes there are ones that you think like, oh man, this really should have an impact. And then you see it and you're like, Okay, how did that not move the needle at all? This year's winner for the best documentary feature, which actually is a nominee for the Versus Awards, so people should have a look at it. 20 Days in Mariupol. That does get into, you get to see firsthand some stuff that happens in wartime. You see some things that happen in the hospitals. I'm trying to find, I can't remember the name of one. Maybe Brandon will remember it. There was one from a couple of years ago that I think did take place in the Middle East. Like, if it wasn't Gaza,
There's one in Syria.
it might have been Syria. Yeah. Do you remember the title? I'm
I
trying.
don't remember the name, but yeah, it was in Syria, and you got to see basically beyond the battle lines.
Yeah, it was a rough one. Oh,
Yeah.
it was a rough.
And I will say this: most Americans came down on the civilian side for Syria, but it was again, I disagree that it's had no effect, because if it had no effect, then you wouldn't have the number of demonstrations out there, because those people are looking at this information and believing it. But the problem is when you have a society that's extremely polarized.
Forsama was the one.
Yeah. To the point where, where the sides that are polarized look at anything that disagrees with their point of view and say, well, that's just fake. And unfortunately, because society has the ability to fake that stuff, it's not hard to push that narrative. It's hard to get sympathy from people who would not be willing to give their time to, or be inclined to support a particular cause. It's harder and harder to convert somebody from one cause to the other these days, because it's so easy to now look and say, well, my worldview is justified by X, Y, and Z, and everything else is fake. It's so much easier to say that these days than it was 60 years ago.
I agree with that. I think my point was more that it was less so. I think my point was more it's like less so of an impact rather than like zero impact. Although I probably did kind of, when I talk about this stuff, like I see the things that I'm referencing to in my head, and it does kind of fluster me a little bit. So.
Yeah, I mean, I understand vicarious trauma, believe me. I mean, 2020 itself put me through enough vicarious trauma. But I mean, the things I've seen make me glad that I don't work out of the hospitals anymore. I can only imagine the kind of things I would have seen had I originally. I know one of the things that I was thinking about doing, and I remember that was doing rehab counseling work and emergency therapy work out of the military in the Middle East as a contractor. But thank goodness I got work elsewise. That would have probably scarred me for life even worse than what I've had to deal with over the last 20 years. And trust me, I've seen stuff there. I mean, I remember seeing a true decapitation in front of me. Watch the head separate from the shoulders and bounce.
Damn.
I have seen plenty of that stuff in real life. And it does stick with you. I can only imagine what would happen in the battle lines, or just steps from the battle lines, as people are coming in like that constantly.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd only deal with something that bad maybe once every other month. But with them, that would be daily.
And like with me, I'm just seeing it like on a screen too. Like I'm not actually there in person, and I think that that tones it down in a way, and that you're able to kind of dissociate it more. Except it's real.
And I'll admit, seeing that stuff and working in an ER during 2020 gives me a whole new perspective anybody who denied that that stuff was real, it gave me a whole new perspective on what I thought of those people.
Right.
It's not until you experience some of the reality of these situations firsthand until you realize, how serious some of these situations are. I mean,
Yeah.
it's all fine and well to read it in a book and see it in a movie, but when you start to see it in your daily life, like in front of you, then that's an entirely different matter. And
Mhm.
sometimes they can scar you, and sometimes they
But speaking of the movie, though, getting back to that,
Yeah.
that ending was brutal.
Yeah.
I mean, he survived that long. It was very interesting timing that
Yeah.
he just so happened to finally have the one bullet to take him out after all that time when his friend came there and faced off against him.
Yeah. So yeah, basically, as we said before, when Mike found out that Nick had been sending lots and lots of money to their other friend, he was like, I think I know what he's doing. So he goes to Vietnam looking for him. He finds the Frenchman and basically browbeats it out of him. I guess he took the money back with him so he could bribe people. Either that or he had a lot of savings, but he was bribing people right and left and eventually found his way into the ring where he basically got himself into a one-on-one with Nick. Nick barely acknowledged him, barely noticed, or barely showed any sign of recognition. He actually spat at him, which my understanding, I can't remember if it was Walken or Cimino who suggested it to the other, but they apparently did not tell De Niro. So when Walken spit on him, De Niro wasn't expecting it. Apparently, he got pissed and almost stormed off the set. But it was interesting to see how they played that out. As they're sitting there, Nick showed no sign of recognition, but as they're sitting there, Mike is basically pleading with him to come back and stop all this. You see chinks in the armor, but you get that feeling of why he's doing what he's doing, and it's not going to end well.
This is, by the way, the scene that you see pictured behind us.
Yes. Which is interesting that everyone sees the artwork of De Niro wearing the red headband, but he never actually does.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
That's the other thing that I always remember this movie having more Russian roulette than it really did. Because I swear, because that's the part that really sticks with you.
Mm-hmm.
The movie has a lot of slowness to it.
Yeah.
And those parts are just have you biting your nails. So I guess that's what would stick with you when you get out of it.
And this part is where that conversation from earlier comes back around and plays really nicely. Mike is sitting there just trying to tell Nick, come back. We'll go hunting, don't forget the trees. You love the trees. This is not your country. That's your country. You need to come back. And you see Nick kind of thinking, you see him reacting. And that's when he brings back the line. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but he brings back the line of basically, it only takes one shot. And that's when, yeah.
All he says is one shot. And it's like, I kind of get the impression that he's just doing the roulette, pulling the trigger, reflexively. That he just empties himself out, when he does this.
Yeah.
And it's he's starting to think it over and almost just pulls that trigger without really thinking about it. But he still says one shot, he's thinking about the hunting trips.
Yeah.
And this just happens to be the time he loses.
And we should mention as well that De Niro did pull the trigger, that Mike did pull the trigger himself first. And that's where you see Nick really kind of almost come back. You see that his friend was willing to risk his own life for him, but it wasn't enough, basically. And then, of course, we got the funeral, and that's scene. That's end of the film. What a uplifting ending.
Well, don't they sing? Don't they sing like some like? I don't think it's like the. What do they sing? They sing some pro-American song. The kind of thing you learn in elementary school. And
I think they sing "America the Beautiful" or whatever. Like one of
Okay, that sounds right.
Yeah, that sounds about right. There are a couple of songs in here. That, of course, is one of them. Or one that's or God Bless America. Sorry, God Bless America is the one. One that's repeated a few times is "Can't Take My Eyes Off of You." And then there's a couple others that are mentioned here and there. I think Troika is the really fun Russian folk song that I did like them playing that because I like this song so much. But anyway, that was in the wedding scene. But yeah, we got a couple of different ones here and there. Apparently, I think it's Midnight Train to Georgia that was slightly anachronistic. It actually came out months after the war ended, and they played it, I think, before they went to war. So that was a little bit off. But anywho, that's the plot.
It was God Bless America.
Right. Right. Does anyone have anything that they want to talk about regarding production?
The prison camp looked pretty realistic. I totally bought that setting. And when they were floating down the river on the debris, I was wondering if they had actually filmed it in Vietnam or like where this countryside was, because it had to be a location. It was a jungle.
The in-country scenes were filmed in Thailand. Apparently, This is the first film to be filmed in Thailand.
Oh, really?
Related. It was the first one to be first Vietnam film to be shot quote on location, but it wasn't exactly location. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And apparently the American scenes were shot on location, but again, it wasn't exactly location. It was Pennsylvania, but it was also like West Virginia, Ohio. The hunting scenes were in Washington. Yeah.
Where were the mountain scenes?
Washington.
Yep.
Yeah.
Those were some really, really nice scenes. I mean,
right.
It was just beautiful looking at.
Probably a little more massive than most of the mountains you would find in Pennsylvania, but
my opinion on the mountains and stuff is the same as it was like in Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
This is just a funny thing, but it does seem to piss people off sometimes when it's like I was at the Rocky Mountain National Park, and because I studied nature, like I see that kind of thing like all the time. I mean, yeah, only in pictures, but I mean, I know what mountains look like. And, my friend is like a total tourist. It's like, wow, look at the mountains. Isn't this amazing? And I'm looking around kind of like, yeah, they're rocks. I got to go to the bathroom. I was a little less impressed by that scene.
So one thing...
But they were very pretty.
Yeah. One thing I thought was really funny as far as the production goes, and I'm not even going to bother looking for it because there was so much stuff on IMDb. But one thing, apparently the bar that their friend owns, they apparently built a bar set on a vacant piece of property. And I guess they did a really good job of it because apparently it was then turned into an actual functional bar that the local mill workers used. So it was life imitating art, I guess.
Just imagine the guy. Oh wait, why isn't there a bar right here? This is great.
Exactly. It's like so that was kind of an interesting tidbit that I read. As far as the overall production, the movie did win 5 Oscars in addition to Best Picture. One of them was for sound, and it won for, I think it was editing. So it did win for sound and editing. It was nominated for cinematography. And I would personally say I think all 3 were pretty solid in terms of the what was made, what went together to make the film. Those were all pretty solid. It did also win Best Director. It won Best Supporting Actor for Christopher Walken. Winner for Best Picture, and De Niro and Streep were both nominated in, De Niro for actor and Streep for supporting actress. The movie ranks 197 on IMDb's top 250. It is a perennial favorite, even though it's controversial in some corners. Definitely ranks highly. And I would say solid production design is a big part of that. From what I heard of Cimino's direction, it might have been a bit rough working for the man. And apparently a lot of people thought that they got screwed over because of him. I already talked about his Derek Washburn, the script writer, and the conversations there. But it's interesting. Sometimes people have a massively successful film that they then try to parlay into their passion projects. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Cimino was able to do anything he wanted after this, and he made Heaven's Gate. And apparently that turned out to be one of the biggest flops in movie history.
Wow.
But it does have a Criterion release, so I'll have to get it eventually.
It was an interesting film, but I would say definitely not the best film in the world.
I am somewhat shocked this does not have a Criterion release yet, but one of these days.
Oh, there's a pretty good Shout Factory release. My friend Justin Beam did the extras for it.
I almost got it earlier this season. I do have the Legacy Series collection, and from what I understand, I think the Shout release mostly repackaged that collection. I should have done it because it would be taking up a lot less space on the shelf than the one I have.
I know he did make new stuff for it, in addition to, because usually what Shout Factory likes to do is they like to port over all of the old extras. And then add their own stuff so that their release becomes kind of the definitive release for a while.
Which is nice. And I am definitely thinking if that one goes on sale again, it is in my crosshairs, as it were. But
I used to just buy all the titles to support back when I could afford to do that.
Yeah.
So this is something that was on my list for that reason too. Yeah. And I was just unable to pick it up.
Right. I just did not realize until I'm watching this thing in the background, like the trailer that they play on IMDb, and they showed a scene of De Niro where I'm like, I did not realize that he kind of looked a little Adam Sandler-ish at that age.
He looked different at that age.
He did. He was a whole lot younger.
And the way that they had him done. Anyway, he wasn't as recognizable as his typical self because usually he's clean shaven. You can see that mole of his out prominent. It's like you can't see that with him there. It's very different. Not unrecognizable, but definitely you have to look a moment.
And as with many people, moles become more prominent with age. And definitely several of his 70s roles, it wasn't as obvious. But yeah, I agree. This one, they made him look a little different. A few of them looked a little different than what I'm used to. Kazale honestly looked like he was dying. And that was one thing. I don't know if I mentioned it at the top, but they arranged it to film all of his scenes first. And like I said, when the brass found out he was dying, they tried to get him fired, and it did not work. Streep had his back. Cimino had his back. They were like, he is in this film. So, good on them for that. But you can tell that he was ill, though. You can definitely tell. Other than that, did y'all have anything to say on? We've talked a little bit about some of the songs, but overall, what did y'all think of the music?
I thought the music was serviceable.
They had music.
It didn't stand out to me very much.
It did. It had music by I need to look this up. Sorry. Music by Stanley Myers. It's not an aggressive theme. You don't hear a whole lot there. But personally, I thought it was really nice. It was a very pretty theme. It just wasn't hugely there most of the time.
More memorable.
Yeah, it definitely served the moment very well. It definitely did a really good job of playing, of backing the story. And Myers has gone on to do some interesting stuff. A very different film he scored was Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. That was slightly different.
Identical to this film in every way.
Exactly. But yeah, I'm just looking through to see if there were any other notable ones. We mentioned some of the songs. So I guess, overall it was appropriate, but not. It sounds like most of us aren't going to be sitting around listening to the soundtrack.
No, definitely not.
I'll probably pick it up eventually, just because, but
yeah,
it's not going to be a high priority.
Even though I'm glad I've seen this film, I thought the production overall was relatively decent myself. The wedding scenes could have been cut down at least by 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we didn't exactly need the fiddler on the roof wedding.
Well, and one of the controversies apparently came between Cimino and the editor of the film, who again ended up winning the Oscar, Peter Zinner, who Cimino later claimed he cut the film, that Zinner was an idiot and he cut the whole movie, but he didn't actually win the Oscar for it. That went to
I was gonna say, I'm not sure that I would want to say cutting the film would have been my big thing, because I feel like the editing in this film was probably one of the weakest parts of it, because there were some parts of it that felt like it was just raggedly cut.
Yeah.
I just don't. I mean, to me, if there is a weakest link for me in the film, it's the editing.
So the cinematographer, Vilmos Zsigmond, had won the previous year for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He was nominated again for The River and for The Black Dahlia. And in between, he had an interesting filmography. He did a number of Woody Allen films. You'll Meet a Tall Dark Stranger, Cassandra's Dream, Melinda and Melinda. He also did Kevin Smith's Jersey Girl. He did Maverick. He did The Bonfire of the Vanities, The Witches of Eastwick, Real Genius. He had an interesting career as a filmmaker. So interesting as a cinematographer, I should say. And then again, Cimino, this was his second feature film after Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, which is a film I still need to see. That was, I think, Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges. He went on to make Heaven's Gate, The Year of the Dragon, The Sicilian, Desperate Hours, The Sun Chasers, and a segment in To Each His Own Cinema. And that was it. Apparently, his reputation of apparently caught up to him at one point. I guess would be the case. So, yeah, and then of course, we know the actors went on to great things, except Cazale, it was his swan song. But a few people have heard of Meryl Streep since then, and Christopher Walken, and
it's sort of funny because for a very long time, when movies were like advertised, it's like starring Christopher Walken, and it's like, why does everybody act like why do I keep thinking I should know who he is? Like, what's he in? Why is his name so big so soon? And it's like, oh, okay, I get it now. So again, this movie answered quite a lot of questions.
Well, Walken also had a number of roles. Like De Niro was already becoming a star when this film came out. And it was partly because of him that it was made at all, because they got him to sign on. And they're like, hey, look, we got De Niro. And he happened to be friends with Meryl Streep. So that helped get her on board. That brought in John Cazale because he was dating her at the time. I don't 100% know the rest of it, but like, let's say, for example, with Walken, The Dead Zone came out in 83. That was just a few years after this. Pennies from Heaven in 81. He was also in Heaven's Gate. So he did have some high profile, and he had a very
I remember him in a canonized version of Puss in Boots.
Yes, that was in the late 80s, I think.
Yep, so, and he also front-runnered the Prophecy series.
And he was a Bond villain in A View to a Kill in the mid-'80s. Yes. So he had some high-profile roles in the 80s and 70s, but definitely once the 90s came around, he became that guy that was in everything.
Yep. And he also played alongside Adam Sandler in Click.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was in Pulp Fiction. He was in Wayne's World 2. He was in True Romance. He was in, Nick of Time. A bunch of stuff that is of less note.
I bet they got him for that role in Pulp Fiction just because of this. The whole story. It's like we were.
I have no doubt.
And it's like, oh.
Tarantino has a history of casting people for very specific reasons, and I believe that. I can't remember for sure, but I think he was cast because of this movie. So yeah, there are.
You cannot forget that Christopher Walken was caught up in that whole business with Natalie Wood, with her death.
Right. Let's see. So that is, I guess that's pretty much. Does anyone else have anything else they want to talk about the movie before we do favorites, or do we go on to that?
Oh, let's hit those favorites.
Okay. So this is going to be a movie where it's going to be kind of hard to say favorites necessarily, but it just for shits and giggles, as they say. Let's say, would you what would you say is, if not your favorite, then the most memorable? We'll go with that. Most favorite or memorable character and scene or a line of dialogue in the film. And I guess we'll just say, since this is a month where we're dealing with war movies and we're dealing with different aspects, and we did hit a pretty good broad assortment. We had a Pacific theater World War II movie. We had a European theater World War II movie. We got a Vietnam movie, and next week we'll do Cold War. Let's just say, if y'all can think of a war movie that features a different war that you would have liked to cover or hope that we hit somewhere in the future, let's do that as a bonus thing. So let's start with you, Dustin. What would you say on those three questions? Or maybe Dustin stepped away for a minute.
I forgot I was muted because I did start talking. It's like, okay, so for a different time period war, what would be an interesting one? I almost jokingly was like, oh, Alex Garland's Civil War, because I've listened to like a full length like analysis of that movie, and it is so bullshit. It sounds like it would actually be pretty funny to watch.
Okay.
But I don't really want to submit that because I would feel bad about it. I mean, The Patriot's a crowd pleaser. Most people like that. And I don't hate it, so that would be fun. Or I don't know.
That was Revolutionary War, right?
Yeah. Oh, did we already hit up Revolutionary War?
Right.
No, I don't think we did in this war category. So,
Yeah.
So I mean, that could have been fun. And I was so busy thinking about those answers. Like, what were the other two questions? Oh, what was my quote unquote favorite thing? Well, I do actually have a favorite scene in this, and it's during the second hunting trip when he just puts, Mr. Toy Gun in his place. That was great. Like, I really love that.
Okay.
So it's like, I mean, this guy's whole personality is around, oh yeah, look how tough I am with my gun. Yeah, even though he's like never been in a truly like hard situation before.
Right.
And I always like seeing characters like that really put on the spot, and they always crumble so badly. So that was just straight up my favorite scene. And then he does indeed like step outside and just toss that stupid thing like into the woods.
Right.
And it's like, you don't get to have this anymore. Fuck this. So, I mean, that was great. And then I guess what was the third question?
Just favorite character or most notable character or what have you?
Well, I mean, it's going to be hard not pick Mike, although, well, Nick has a lot of interesting stuff going on, too. I think the character I feel most bad for is Stevie, just because almost the worst happens to him. I mean, this is a movie where we can kind of get invested in everyone to a degree, so I'll just be lazy and go with Mike.
Okay. Sounds good. Now, I know, Tammy, you say you are not a war movie buff, and you said you kind of had to scramble to come up with the Cold War choice, but do you have any others that have come to mind that might fit for that one question, and what would be your answer on the other question?
Well, I guess I would only be able to say like maybe other ones that I've seen over the years. Like I've seen Platoon.
Okay.
I've seen Saving Private Ryan. I saw Red Dawn.
Okay. That's also Cold War, right? If I remember correctly.
Well, Red Dawn is Cold War becoming a hot war, but yeah.
Well, yeah.
So I don't really know how all those fit, but those are the ones that I have seen,
Well, definitely Platoon is Vietnam, and Saving Private Ryan would be European theater or World War II. But those are by far the lion's share of the war movies most people see, especially World War II.
Man, whenever Platoon comes up, like all I can ever think about is that joke from the montage in The Naked Gun where they walk out of the theater, like they walk out of the theater like laughing, like on a date, and the marquee just set behind them just says Platoon.
Oh, jeez.
Shit.
Okay. So, Tammy, what would you say are your favorites then?
Well, my favorite character is Mike. So, he just was, I don't know how, he was a leader, but yet his ways of thinking seemed a little bit different from everybody, and I don't know, I liked Mike. But my favorite scene was the second hunting trip when he didn't shoot the deer.
Okay. Sounds good. How about you, Dave?
Well, I'd have to say, I'm kind of on the fence with Christopher Walken being one of my favorites and Mike being my favorite because Walken actually does a really phenomenal job in this movie, as showing
Indeed.
that kind of a character, whereas Mike, he's like kind of like The Rock, and he's the hero and the one that everybody can rely on, and the one that actually brings almost everybody back from the war, including because one of the things that I think we didn't mention is the war with themselves afterwards, because Stephen was at war with not going home.
Yeah.
By kind of resolving himself to being kind of a mental patient in that military ward.
Right.
But
we don't actually know what was said between him and Angela, but you almost get the impression that he might have been even more forceful with her than he was with Mike. And that might have scared the crap out of her. But
maybe so. And I also do think that Stephen was also experiencing PTSD from what
no
he
doubt.
had to. As far as favorite scenes, memorable scenes, I would have to say the initial Russian roulette scene. I mean, they didn't know whether they were going to live or die. Although Mike seemed determined to be like the Rock of that, even there, because he was convinced, trying to stay the morale of Stephen and the other guy, at least while they were in that caged area. And I guess I'll remember the moment between Robert De Niro and Christopher Walken towards the end, as well. And as far as war movies that I might want to cover in the future, Last of the Mohicans is one that I'd like to cover.
Now that one was that the French and Indian Wars? Am I remembering?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, it's been a minute since I've seen that, but that was a solid one. Okay. How about you, Brandon?
Well, my favorite character is the Frenchman.
It would be.
My favorite scene is the scene at the beginning at the bar where they run into the Green Beret. That is perfect foreshadowing. Love it. And then I guess I have a couple that would be kind of cool. Dr. Strangelove.
Oh, yes.
For the Cold War. It's surprising that we haven't covered that one yet.
Yes.
But also one that I thought was interesting that I'd love to revisit is Jarhead, because it's a hard one to watch, but it's actually, I think it's the only one that cover Desert Storm.
One of the few. I want to say Three Kings was also a Desert
Yeah.
Storm movie,
but it was also more of a heist movie. So this is the only one I can think of that actually was like the war. And that's so, it's kind of interesting to see those. But yeah,
Another one I wouldn't mind covering is Enemy at the Gates.
Okay. Well, I have an unwatched copy. No, that's Enemy of the State.
Oh, yeah.
The Gates. That was that it? That
sniper movie during the Second World War, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, something about. I think it was in Berlin or something, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So
for that one.
All righty. So for me, I guess I'm probably going to also say if I had to pick a favorite character, Mike, but I think Nick is right up there in terms of like, I don't know. I think they were both great characters and very, very well acted. Overall, the acting was solid, so it's kind of hard to fault anyone for that, but our main cast was all pretty well balanced for the most part. But as far as favorites, if I had to pick one single moment, I think the moment where the wine drops on Angela's dress, actually, Cimino will be happy to know that I thought that was worth the effort. I thought that was a great shot. It was very effective foreshadowing. The scene with the Green Beret in the bar, the scenes with the Russian roulette were also very effective. And I agree with Tammy. I was happy he didn't kill the second deer. I was really happy to see that was a change that had come over him. Although originally I thought it was because he couldn't kill anymore. And then the more I thought about it, I thought maybe it was because without Nick there, it didn't have the same meaning for him. So it kind of been a little bit of both. But they're all good scenes. But I think the wine drop is my top pick. One of the reasons I decided what's that?
I kept expecting there to be a scene where, like, to finish a deer off, he grabs it by its antlers and just like breaks its neck. So I wanted to see that because that's what I had been told was in this movie for 20 years. So I was waiting for that.
Right.
I was pretty let down by the second deer scene.
Deleted scene.
Right. So this is going to be one of those they want to do like, they say with the Justice League release the Snyder cut, with Cats they said release the butthole cut. You want to see release the neck breaking cut. But I don't
know if you want to call it that, like on the box.
But one of the reasons why I came up with that question was I almost picked a different film. Basically, this one, like I said, I had Vietnam on the mind because of that book I just read, and I needed an excuse to watch my copy. And I thought, and I think I was correct, that this would be a movie that would give us a good discussion. Plus, it's such a well-known and classic film that it's nice to hit those every now and then. But the one that I really want to cover, that if we do another war month will be my choice, is one that kind of like what Brandon was talking about. There are wars that don't have very many movies attached to them. There is a Bosnian film called No Man's Land that takes place during the Bosnian-Serbian War. And it is a phenomenal film. It is absolutely phenomenal film. And I really do hope we get to cover it one of these days. We got for World War I, we got the recent remake of All Quiet on the Western Front would be a phenomenal choice, and so would 1917.
Or
They've
Dunkirk.
already done Ride with the Devil, so the Civil War has been hit, but I'm sure there'd be some good ones. There's a lot of interesting war possibilities, but
The
I'm
Emu
definitely.
War.
What's that?
The Emu War.
The Emu War, yeah.
That's
And I was even thinking about Paradise Now, which is about the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That would even be a really good one to hit one of these days. So,
Good Morning Vietnam.
Good Morning Vietnam would be another good Vietnam War. Yes, a good Vietnam movie. Yes.
MASH.
What happened?
MASH. Which is
MASH,
the Vietnam War masquerading
Korean
as the
War, yes.
Korean War.
Yes, the Korean War. You're right. MASH would be a really good one to hit one of these days. And then Taegugi, the Brotherhood of War, I want to say is also the Korean War, but that's a Asian film. So there are some really awesome options. And in our discussion for Barefoot again, we mentioned a few times, I really hope we get to hit In This Corner of the World one of these days. So there's a lot of great options out there, but it'll be nice next week to hit one that's a little less heavy. But I guess that about that. Does anyone else have any final thoughts on the Deer Hunter?
Not that I know of.
Okay, well, I guess that wraps her up then. Dave, have at it.
Buy the Shot Factory 4K disc.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess let's go around and let them know a little bit about ourselves and what we do. So, Dustin, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do?
Well, I collect horror movie stuff here in Milwaukee. I have a channel for the collection, The Crypt of Horrors, and an Instagram for the collection, The Crypt of Horrors. And both have been shut down because I am living in hell currently. But we are trying to escape and hopefully can get some new content shot for you guys pretty soon. So go subscribe and make me feel bad that I'm not uploading anything. It'll make me work faster, I promise.
Alrighty. Very cool. So let's go over to you, Tammy. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
I go on this channel, another one with David, and discuss movies and hear everybody's opinions and check out things I probably never would have. And now that it's summertime, I take my car out to car shows and just had to put a little plug in here. We had a beautiful one over the weekend. We raised money for Make-A-Wish Foundation for a little girl.
Alrighty. Heading over to you, Jake. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
All right, I'm Kotobukijake. I am the occasional co-host of SeptumSin versus the World on YouTube, where we talk about physical media and all kinds of fun stuff there. And theoretically, also have a YouTube channel of my own, Kotobukijake, but I am haven't updated it in a long time, and I've been trying to get myself back to that point of headspace to start doing it. Again, it'll be a nature themed channel, and I'm probably going to rebrand it when I do, but that may be on the horizon, but I can't tell you how far off because I'm not sure. Meanwhile, I keep very busy most of the time. I wish there was more time in the day, especially when we keep doing 3-hour movies for this channel. But and one thing coming up that I'm very much looking forward to is that we'll be covering Bakano on the movies on SeptumSin at the end of the month. Brandon, is that next week or it's next week, right?
What was it?
Bakano?
Bakano is next Wednesday.
Yeah, so that's going to be a lot of fun. Looking forward to that one. I've started it. It's about time. But I do, make time for each week to watch movies, to join these fine folks for our discussions. And it's always fun to check out things you might not have seen otherwise. I I started the month with 2 movies I had never seen before, and I'm ending with 2 movies I had seen before. So, it's a pretty good balance. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Alrighty. Heading over to you, Brandon. Heading over to you, Brandon. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
I'll be brief. Check out SeptumSin versus the World. Vote in the Versus Awards. There's a link in the description down below. Very important. We'd like to get a variety of votes if we can. Lastly, watch us next week when we cover Hunt for Red October. That is all.
Alrighty. I'm one of the founding fathers of Inside Movies Galore. So thank you for coming along with us on this fantabulous journey we've been having. Let us know down in the comments of what you thought of our discussion, what you thought of the movie, and whether or not you had various opinions that differed from us. Have at it. We'd like to know. Let us know in the comments below. But I also moonlight on a different channel called Delusions of Grandeur, where we also go on every Sunday at roughly about 12:30, 1 o'clock. And I do believe that this Sunday we are hitting up the last Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Men Tell No Tales, to finish out the Pirates series. Keep a lookout for that discussion. But I do some video pickups and some video reviews from time to time, and whatnot. So definitely go over to the both channels and check out what we all have. And as things go forward here, still working on the second anthology of Tales of the Forgotten. We did just finish a short film for it, almost. So good times there. So yeah. So keep a lookout for when that the end of that happens as well. Hopefully by summer's end, hopefully we'll maybe at least have something to say for ourselves and all the work that we've gone into doing it. So in any case, like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next week here on Inside Movies Galore. Thank you so much. Everyone say good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.